The billionaire stormed his ex-wife's home to mock her, then was frozen when he saw a newborn baby. She never planned to tell him about their baby. For 3 years after their divorce, Madison Reed had meticulously rebuilt her life without Nathaniel Kingston, the man who had systematically crushed her confidence and dismissed her dreams. But on a snowy December morning, her carefully guarded secret came screaming into the world when her billionaire ex-husband stormed into her home, only to freeze in shock at the sound of a newborn's cry. The baby was his, conceived during one night of weakness when a coastal storm had trapped them together in Savannah. And now, standing in the doorway of the nursery, the color draining from his face as he stared at the infant with his unmistakable features, Madison realized some secrets can't stay buried forever. What would you do if the person who once crushed your self-worth suddenly had the legal right to be part of your life again? How far would you go to protect not just your heart, but your child's future? Stay with me to discover how one tiny baby forced 2 broken people to confront the truth they'd been running from for years. Madison Reed stood at her kitchen window, absently stirring honey into her tea as she watched the first snowfall of December drift across her small backyard garden. The white flakes softened the edges of the raised beds she'd built last spring, beds now dormant, waiting for the promise of another season. At 35, Madison had finally found peace in these quiet moments. The modest Victorian home in Atlanta's historic district wasn't grand by any measure, but it was hers, bought with the proceeds from her successful interior design firm that had, against all odds, flourished after her divorce from Nathaniel Kingston 3 years ago. The sudden blare of a car horn shattered the tranquility. Madison glanced at her watch with a frown. 7:15 a.m. on a Saturday. Too early for visitors, especially in this peaceful neighborhood where most residents respected the unspoken weekend morning quiet. When the doorbell rang, an insistent, repeated pressing rather than a polite announcement, Madison set down her tea with a sigh. Through the frosted glass panels flanking her front door, she could make out a tall, masculine silhouette. The moment she turned the deadbolt, the door pushed open with force that nearly knocked her backward. "Where is he?" Nathaniel Kingston demanded, striding into her foyer without invitation. Madison steadied herself against the wall, momentarily stunned by the intrusion. Her ex-husband filled the space with his imposing presence. 6 feet of tailored charcoal suit, cashmere overcoat, and cold fury. The financial media called him the Wolf of Peachtree Street, a self-made billionaire whose investment firm had transformed downtown Atlanta's skyline. She called him the mistake she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. "Good morning to you too, Nathaniel," she said, fighting to keep her voice level. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Nathaniel's steel-gray eyes scanned her living room with open disdain. "Cut the pleasantries, Madison. Where are you hiding him?" "Hiding who?" She crossed her arms, keeping her distance. 3 years since their divorce had been finalized, and still, his proximity made her pulse quicken. Not from lingering attraction, but from the body's memory of stress, of walking on eggshells, of never quite measuring up. "Don't play innocent." He moved further into her home, uninvited. "Your new benefactor, the mystery man who's been funneling money into that little hobby business of yours." Madison's confusion gave way to indignation. "My hobby business grossed $2.3 million last year without any benefactor, mystery or otherwise. Not that my finances are any of your concern anymore." Nathaniel snorted, running a finger across her bookshelf as if checking for dust. "Please, interior design for middle-class homes in East Atlanta? That doesn't generate the kind of capital you've been throwing around." "What are you talking about?" "The downtown office space you just leased. The feature in Southern Living. The sudden ability to outbid Kingston Developments for the Westmoreland renovation project." His voice hardened with each example. "You couldn't manage a household budget when we were married, Madison. You expect me to believe you've become a business genius overnight." The casual cruelty of his dismissal stung, despite the years and therapy sessions between then and now. Madison took a steadying breath, reminding herself that his opinion no longer defined her worth. "I've always been capable, Nathaniel. You just preferred me dependent." She gestured toward the door. Now if you've finished insulting me in my own home, I have a business to run. All by myself, shocking as that may be to your enormous ego. Instead of leaving, Nathaniel stalked closer, invading her personal space with practiced intimidation. Who is he, Madison? One of my competitors? Is that what this is about? Using you to get to me? Not everything is about you, she said, refusing to back away despite the rapid beating of her heart. There is no he. I built my business through talent, hard work, and clients who appreciate quality design that doesn't require an 8-figure bank account. Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond when a faint sound from upstairs caught both their attention. The soft, unmistakable cry of a newborn. His expression transformed from anger to shock in an instant. What was that? Madison felt the blood drain from her face. Not now. Not like this. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. I think you should leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The crying grew louder, more insistent. You have a baby? Nathaniel's voice was strangled, his composure cracking. Is that what this is about? You've been hiding a child from me? Before Madison could stop him, Nathaniel was taking the stairs 2 at a time, following the sound. She rushed after him, panic rising in her throat. Nathaniel, stop. You have no right to. He pushed open the door to what had once been a spare bedroom. The space had been transformed into a serene nursery. Walls painted a soft sage green. A white crib positioned beneath the window where morning light filtered through gauzy curtains. Inside the crib, a tiny baby with a shock of dark hair squirmed beneath a light blanket, face reddening with each cry. Nathaniel stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the infant as if he'd seen a ghost. Madison pushed past him, going straight to the crib. She lifted the baby with practiced ease, cradling the small body against her shoulder and making gentle shushing sounds. It's okay, Eliza, she murmured, patting the baby's back. Everything's okay. Nathaniel remained motionless. His usual confidence evaporated. How old? He finally asked, his voice oddly hollow. 3 weeks, Madison answered, not meeting his eyes as she soothed the now quieting infant. 3 weeks, he repeated, his calculating mind visibly working through the implications. And 9 months before that? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Madison felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she held Eliza closer, protectively. Yes, Nathaniel, she said quietly. Do the math. His face paled as the realization struck him. 9 months ago. That would be March, Madison finished for him. The week of the Savannah Heritage Project. Recognition dawned in his eyes. The Savannah Project, when their professional paths had crossed unexpectedly. When 3 years of carefully maintained distance had collapsed during one storm-drenched weekend in a historic hotel where they'd both sought shelter from a coastal deluge. One night of weakness, of remembering what had once been good between them before everything fell apart. The baby is mine, he said. Not a question but a stunned statement of fact. Madison looked down at Eliza, at the tiny face that already showed hints of her father's strong features. The same dark hair, the same determined set of the jaw, even in infancy. Yes, she admitted softly. She's yours biologically, but she's mine in every way that matters. Nathaniel moved closer, almost in a trance, his eyes never leaving the infant. Why didn't you tell me? The question held no accusation, just genuine bewilderment that caught Madison off guard. She'd prepared herself for anger, for legal threats, for the cold, calculating response she'd come to expect from the man he'd become. Not this quiet confusion. Would it have mattered? She countered. You made it very clear during our marriage that children weren't part of your plan, that your empire was your legacy. I didn't want Eliza to be an unwanted obligation. So you just decided for me? His voice hardened slightly, more familiar territory. Determined I had no right to know about my own child? I decided to protect her, Madison said firmly, and myself, from the inevitable legal battles, from being tied to you for the next 18 years through a child you never wanted. You don't know what I want, Nathaniel said, a strange intensity in his voice. You don't know who I am anymore, Madison. The statement hung between them, undeniably true. 3 years of separation, of building separate lives. The man standing before her was both intimately familiar and a complete stranger. Eliza squirmed against Madison's shoulder, making small fussing sounds that signaled hunger. The ordinary needs of a newborn grounding this extraordinary moment. I need to feed her, Madison said, her voice steadier than she felt. Nathaniel didn't move from the doorway. We need to talk about this. Yes, Madison agreed, surprising herself with her calmness. But not now. Not like this, with you barging into my home making accusations. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man known for his unwavering confidence. When? Tomorrow, Madison decided. Come back at noon. I'll have made arrangements for someone to watch Eliza, so we can talk properly. Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the baby. She has my mother's eyes, he said softly, an observation so unexpected it made Madison's throat tighten with emotion. Yes, she whispered. I noticed that too. A moment of connection, fragile and fleeting, before Nathaniel straightened his shoulders, composure returning like a mask sliding back into place. Tomorrow at noon, then. He turned to leave, then paused at the nursery door. For what it's worth, Madison, I never thought your design business was just a hobby. I always knew you were talented. He hesitated, searching for words. I wasn't very good at showing it. The admission, small but significant, left Madison momentarily speechless. By the time she found her voice, he was already heading down the stairs, his footsteps fading. She looked down at Eliza, now blinking up at her with those distinctive Kingston eyes. Well, she murmured, that wasn't how I planned to introduce you to your father. The baby's tiny hand curled around her finger in response, a gesture of perfect trust that strengthened Madison's resolve. Whatever happened next, whatever Nathaniel decided to do with this knowledge, she would protect this precious life they'd created, even from the emotional whirlwind that was Nathaniel Kingston himself. Have you ever had someone underestimate your strength only to be shocked by what you've accomplished? Share your story of proving someone wrong in the comments below. The first time Nathaniel Kingston made Madison feel small was on their third date. She'd mentioned her dream of starting her own interior design firm someday, focusing on sustainable materials and accessible luxury. He'd smiled that charming, indulgent smile that would become all too familiar in their marriage. That's cute, he'd said, reaching for her hand across the table. But real estate development is where the actual money is. Maybe you could help choose fixtures for my properties instead. She'd laughed it off then, flattered by his interest, dazzled by his confidence. It was only the first of countless moments where he would subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, diminish her ambitions. Madison settled into the nursery's rocking chair, adjusting Eliza against her breast. As the baby nursed contentedly, Madison's mind drifted back through the years, trying to pinpoint when exactly she'd lost herself in Nathaniel's shadow. Their courtship had been a whirlwind, 6 months from that first meeting at a charity auction to the lavish wedding featured in Atlanta's society pages. Madison Reed, promising interior designer, marrying rising financial star Nathaniel Kingston. It had seemed like a fairy tale. The reality proved far different. You don't need to work such long hours, he'd say when she stayed late at the small design firm where she'd been building her reputation. I make more than enough for both of us. That color scheme is a bit adventurous for the guest bedroom, don't you think? He'd suggest, when she tried to express her creativity in their own home. Let's be realistic about your talents, he'd advise when she'd talk about striking out on her own. Most small businesses fail in the first year. Each comment delivered with that same smile. Concerned, protective, undermining. By their third anniversary, Madison had all but abandoned her professional aspirations, instead playing the role of the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties, attending charity galas, always impeccably dressed, always careful not to embarrass Nathaniel in front of his increasingly powerful associates. The day she realized she'd become a stranger to herself was the day she found the courage to leave. "I want a divorce," she told him one evening as he reviewed quarterly projections at the dining room table, barely glancing up when she entered. He'd looked at her then, truly looked at her for the first time in months. "Don't be dramatic, Madison. What would you even do without me?" The question, so casually cruel, so genuinely puzzled, had confirmed everything she needed to know. "I guess I'll find out," she'd replied. The divorce had been brutal. Nathaniel, unused to being denied anything he considered his, fought her on every point, dragging out proceedings, questioning her financial competence, suggesting she was emotionally unstable. It took 18 months and every ounce of Madison's determination before she walked away with enough to start over. Her maiden name restored and a modest settlement that she immediately invested in her dream. Madison Reed Design was born in a tiny rented office with second-hand furniture and one part-time assistant. 3 years later, it occupied a stylish downtown space with a staff of 8 and a growing reputation for innovative, accessible designs that didn't require a millionaire's budget. The journey hadn't been easy. There were nights she'd sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by fabric samples and business plans, wondering if Nathaniel had been right about her limitations. Moments when potential clients would learn of her connection to Kingston and either expect discounts because of her wealthy ex-husband or dismiss her as a dilettante playing at business. But each obstacle only strengthened her resolve. Each success, however small, reinforced the woman she was becoming, or perhaps had always been, beneath the layers of doubt Nathaniel had cultivated. Eliza had finished nursing. Madison gently shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting her back with practiced movements that still felt new. Just 3 weeks into motherhood, and already she couldn't imagine life without this tiny being who depended on her completely. Which was precisely why Nathaniel's sudden reappearance in her life terrified her so much. The storm that had brought them together in Savannah 9 months ago had been unexpected in every sense. Madison had traveled to the historic coastal city to pitch her firm for the Heritage Row renovation, a prestigious project that would put Madison Reed Design on the national map. She hadn't known that Kingston Developments was also bidding on the contract until she spotted Nathaniel across the hotel lobby. 3 years of carefully maintained distance collapsed in an instant. Their eyes met, recognition flared, and Madison had felt that old, familiar tightness in her chest, the body's memory of both attraction and anxiety. She turned away immediately, focusing on checking into the historic hotel where project bidders were being housed during the weekend presentations. If she could avoid him for 48 hours, she told herself, she could maintain the careful boundaries she'd established since their divorce. Then the coastal storm hit. Presentations postponed, travel halted, power flickering throughout the historic district. And somehow, inevitably, she and Nathaniel had found themselves in the hotel's candlelit bar as rain lashed against centuries-old windows. "You look good, Madison," he'd said, appearing beside her table with 2 glasses of expensive bourbon. "Success suits you." She'd meant to dismiss him, to maintain her hard-won independence. Instead, she'd found herself accepting the drink, drawn into conversation that flowed more easily than she would have expected after all that had happened between them. "Your firm is doing well," he'd observed. Not a question but a statement. "I've seen your work on the Riverside development." Madison had been surprised he'd noticed. "We're growing steadily." The Riverside project was a turning point, brought in several new commercial clients. "You always had an eye for spaces that could tell a story." There was something different in his tone, respect that hadn't been there during their marriage. One drink had become 2 as the storm intensified outside. Conversation had drifted from business to memories, not of their failed marriage, but of the times before, when they'd been young and ambitious, sharing dreams over cheap wine in Madison's first apartment. "Do you remember what you said to me the night we met?" Nathaniel had asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Madison smiled despite herself. "That your tie was hideous and undermining an otherwise decent suit?" He'd laughed then, a genuine laugh that transformed his face, softening the hard edges success had carved into his features. "And you were right. I burned that tie the next day. Yet you still asked me to dinner." A woman who noticed the tie rather than the bank account was worth pursuing. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. how that initial attraction to her authenticity had eventually given way to his attempts to reshape her. As the night wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, the hotel had lost power completely. Staff distributed additional candles and blankets to guests stranded in common areas. The intimate lighting, the howling wind, the unusual circumstance of being trapped together. It all created a strange bubble outside of time, outside of their complicated history. "I was wrong, Madison." The words had come unexpectedly as they shared a bottle of wine brought by an enterprising bartender determined to keep serving despite the outage. "About so many things, but especially about you." She'd studied his face in the flickering candlelight, searching for the manipulation that had colored so many of his apologies during their marriage. Instead, she'd found something unfamiliar, genuine regret. "It's in the past," she'd said, not ready to offer forgiveness but too exhausted by old anger to sustain it in that moment. When he'd walked her to her room as the hotel generators finally kicked on around midnight, the air between them had crackled with unspoken possibilities. Madison had meant to say goodnight at her door. Instead, she'd found herself inviting him inside, drawn to this glimpse of the man she'd once loved before ambition and control had twisted him. For one night, they'd reconnected, physically, emotionally, in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. In the candlelit darkness of that historic hotel room, with rain lashing against centuries-old windows, they'd found a temporary peace with their past. In the morning, clarity had returned with the sunshine. They'd parted with awkward politeness, both recognizing the night for what it was, an anomaly, a closure of sorts, but not a new beginning. Madison had returned to Atlanta determined to forget the momentary weakness, to refocus on her business, her independence, her carefully constructed life without Nathaniel Kingston. Until the pregnancy test turned positive 6 weeks later. Eliza stirred against Madison's shoulder, drawing her back to the present. The baby's tiny hand curled against her neck, an unconscious gesture of complete trust that brought tears to Madison's eyes. "What am I going to do about your father?" she whispered. The decision not to tell Nathaniel about the pregnancy hadn't been made in a single moment. It had evolved over days of soul-searching, of weighing the man he had been against the glimpse of who he might be becoming, of considering what it would mean to be bound to him for the next 18 years through a child. She remembered his words from their marriage, spoken during a rare vulnerable moment when his sister had announced her third pregnancy. "I'm not father material, Madison. My work requires total commitment. A child deserves better than that." At the time, she'd been devastated. Another dream diminished by his certainty. Now, ironically, those same words had guided her decision to keep Eliza's existence from him. A child did deserve better, better than being an obligation to a man who had never wanted children, better than being a pawn in whatever power dynamic might evolve between her parents. Yet now, watching his face as he first saw his daughter, Madison wondered if she'd misjudged him. The shock in his eyes had been expected, but not the wonder that followed it. Not the softness in his voice when he'd noted Eliza's resemblance to his mother. "We'll figure this out," she promised the now sleeping infant, carefully placing her back in the crib. Somehow, Madison spent a restless night preparing for Nathaniel's return. She'd called her sister Olivia, who had agreed to take Eliza to her house for a few hours, giving Madison the space to have what promised to be a difficult conversation without interruption. By noon, she was perched on the edge of her sofa, tea growing cold beside her, jumping at every sound from the street. Nathaniel Kingston had never been late for anything in his life, a point of pride for a man who considered punctuality a form of power. At precisely 12 o'clock, her doorbell rang. Madison smoothed her hands over her simple wrap dress, chosen carefully to project confidence and composure, and opened the door. Nathaniel stood on her porch looking uncharacteristically informal in dark jeans and a gray cashmere sweater, his usual power suit absent. The casual attire made him seem more approachable, more like the man she'd first fallen in love with years ago. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, the formal words at odds with the intensity in his eyes. Madison stepped back to let him enter. "We have things to discuss." He followed her to the living room, declining her offer of tea or coffee with a shake of his head. Instead of taking a seat, he moved to the mantelpiece where several framed photographs stood. His attention fixed on a new addition, Madison in a hospital bed, holding a swaddled Eliza. "My mother took that," Madison offered, watching him carefully. "The day after she was born." Nathaniel nodded without turning. "She looks exactly like Sophia did as a newborn." "Sophia? My sister." Now he did turn, his expression unreadable. "The one who died before I met you." Madison felt a pang of surprise. In 5 years of marriage, Nathaniel had rarely spoken of his younger sister, whose childhood illness had shaped his family in ways he'd never fully explained. That he would mention her now in connection with Eliza felt significant in ways Madison couldn't quite articulate. "I didn't know," she said softly. "There's a lot we didn't know about each other, despite being married." Nathaniel finally sat down across from her, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "I've spent the night thinking about what to say to you today, preparing arguments, considering legal options." Madison stiffened. "If you're planning to threaten me with custody battles." "I'm not," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Though I would be within my rights." "Your rights?" Madison felt heat rising in her cheeks. "You forfeited any claim to parental rights when you made it abundantly clear during our entire marriage that you never wanted children." "People change, Madison." His voice remained calm despite the challenge in her words. "I've changed. In 3 years? The man who told me that children were incompatible with his vision for the future has suddenly developed paternal instincts. Forgive me if I'm skeptical." Nathaniel leaned forward, eyes intent on hers. "Do you know why I came to your house yesterday?" The abrupt change of subject caught Madison off guard. "You said something about my business having a mysterious benefactor." "That was the excuse," he admitted. "The truth is, I've been keeping track of your career since the divorce, watching you build something impressive from the ground up. When you won the bid for the Westmoreland project, beating my company in the process, I was angry," Madison suggested when he hesitated. "Intrigued," he corrected. "And yes, perhaps a little threatened. The Madison I was married to wouldn't have had the confidence to go head-to-head with Kingston Developments. She would have backed down, deferred, second-guessed herself. The assessment, while painfully accurate, stung nonetheless. I'm not that person anymore." Clearly, a hint of admiration colored his voice. "You've become exactly who you always had the potential to be. Who you might have been sooner if I hadn't." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. They both knew how his domineering personality had overshadowed hers during their marriage, how his dismissive attitude toward her ambitions had gradually eroded her confidence. "If you're here to apologize for our failed marriage, it's unnecessary," Madison said, keeping her voice neutral despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "We've both moved on." "Have we?" Nathaniel's gaze was penetrating. "Because it seems the universe had other plans. Eliza is proof of that. One night of weakness doesn't erase 3 years of separate lives." "Nathaniel." Madison stood, needing to put physical distance between them. "Eliza was unexpected. Yes, but that doesn't change the fundamental issues that drove us apart. What if those issues have changed?" He rose as well, following her movement. "What if I've changed?" Madison gave a disbelieving laugh. 3 years of silence, and now suddenly you want to be father of the year? "What exactly are you proposing here, Nathaniel?" "I want to be part of her life," he said simply. "Our daughter's life. Our daughter." The words hit Madison with unexpected force. Until this moment, Eliza had been hers alone. Her decision, her responsibility, her joy. The thought of sharing her, of Nathaniel claiming space in their carefully constructed world, sent panic spiraling through her chest. "It's not that simple," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You can't just decide you want to be a father now that the baby actually exists. Parenthood doesn't work that way." "Then teach me how it works," Nathaniel challenged, taking a step closer. "Give me the chance to learn, to be the father Eliza deserves." The sincerity in his voice caught Madison off guard. This wasn't the calculated, controlling man she'd divorced, or at least not entirely. There was something different in his eyes, something that hinted at depths she'd never been allowed to see during their marriage. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why now, Nathaniel? What's changed?" He was silent for a long moment, his expression shifting through emotions she couldn't quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice held a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "6 months ago, I was diagnosed with a heart condition," he said, the admission clearly costing him. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to require surgery, medication, lifestyle changes. Madison stared at him, stunned. "I had no idea. No one does. I've kept it private." He moved to the window, looking out at her small garden. "For the first time in my life, I was forced to confront my own mortality, to consider what legacy I'm actually leaving behind, what meaning my life has beyond accumulating wealth and power." He turned back to face her. "The empire I've built won't remember me, Madison. It won't carry my DNA, my history, my hopes into the next generation. But Eliza will." The raw honesty in his voice silenced any reflexive skepticism Madison might have felt. She'd never seen Nathaniel this exposed, this genuine. Even in their most intimate moments during marriage, he had maintained a certain guardedness, as if vulnerability was a weakness he couldn't afford to show. "I'm sorry about your health," she said finally. "But becoming a father isn't something you do to secure your legacy. It's about putting someone else's needs above your own. Always. It's about sleepless nights and endless worry and loving so deeply it physically hurts sometimes. Are you really prepared for that?" "I don't know," he admitted, surprising her again with his candor. "But I want the chance to learn. My queens, if you've ever had to rebuild your trust in someone who once broke it, tap that like button and let's support each other through these challenging journeys." Madison studied him, weighing his words against years of experience with the man he had been. Nathaniel Kingston didn't admit to not knowing things. It had been one of his cardinal rules in business and in life. That simple confession of uncertainty felt more genuine than any elaborate promise could have. "I'll need time," she said finally. "And so will you. This isn't something we can figure out in one conversation." "I understand." Nathaniel's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "What's our first step?" Madison considered the question carefully. "I think you should meet Eliza properly, not as a shock or a revelation, but as her father. She'll be back from my sister's in about an hour." "I'd like that," he said quietly. Then, with hesitation unusual for him, "Madison, there's something else you should know about me, about why children weren't part of my plan." She waited, sensing the importance of whatever he was struggling to share. "My sister Sophia, the one who died, she was only 7. Pain flickered across his face, decades old but still raw. "She had a congenital heart defect similar to the one I was diagnosed with recently. This genetic runs in families. My parents spent every waking moment of her short life in hospitals, watching her suffer, fighting for treatments." Understanding dawned on Madison. "You were afraid of having a child who might inherit the condition." He nodded. "I watched what losing Sophia did to my parents, how it destroyed their marriage, their happiness. My father buried himself in work afterward. Sound familiar?" A bitter smile touched his lips. "I swore I'd never put a child through that suffering or myself through that loss. And now?" Madison asked, though she suspected the answer. "Now I know that my condition is manageable with modern medicine. That Eliza can be monitored from early on if she inherited any predisposition." He met her eyes directly. "And I've realized that protecting yourself from potential pain means missing the greatest joys as well." The revelation cast Nathaniel's past attitudes in a new light. Not just arrogance or ambition, but fear. Deep, foundational fear that had shaped his choices in ways Madison had never understood during their marriage. "Why didn't you tell me this when we were married?" she asked. "All those times we discussed having children. Because the real me, the scared little boy who watched his sister die, wasn't someone I allowed anyone to see. Not even you." Nathaniel's admission carried the weight of years of self-awareness gained too late. I was too busy building the invulnerable image I thought I needed to be successful. Before Madison could respond, the front door opened, and Olivia's voice called out, "We're back early. Someone missed her mama." The moment of connection between Madison and Nathaniel was interrupted as Olivia appeared in the living room doorway, Eliza bundled in her carrier. Olivia stopped short at the sight of Nathaniel, her expression immediately hardening. "What is he doing here?" she demanded, protective instinct flaring as she positioned herself between the baby and the man she considered responsible for her sister's past heartbreak. "It's okay, Liv," Madison said, moving to take Eliza's carrier. "Nathaniel knows about Eliza. He's here to meet her properly." Olivia's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And you're allowing this?" Madison met her sister's concerned gaze with steady confidence. "Yes, he's her father. Biologically, maybe," Olivia muttered, but she relinquished the baby carrier to Madison. To Nathaniel, she added with unmistakable warning, "If you hurt them, either of them, you'll answer to me." Despite her petite frame and soft-spoken nature, Olivia Reed had the fierce protective instinct of a mother bear. The threat wasn't empty. "I understand," Nathaniel said, treating her wariness with respect rather than dismissal. Another departure from the man Madison had known. After a few more protective instructions about Eliza's schedule, Olivia left, casting one last suspicious glance at Nathaniel on her way out. "Your sister hasn't changed," he observed once the door closed behind her. "She remembers how I was after our divorce," Madison said simply, placing Eliza's carrier on the coffee table. She helped pick up the pieces. Madison gently unbuckled the sleeping infant, lifting her into her arms. Eliza stirred, blinking sleepily, her tiny face scrunching briefly before relaxing again. "Would you like to hold her?" Madison asked, surprising herself with the offer. Nathaniel's confident expression gave way to something like nervousness. "I've never held a newborn before. Just support her head and neck," Madison instructed, moving closer. "Here." With careful movements, she transferred Eliza into Nathaniel's arms, adjusting his hold until the baby was secure. The contrast was striking. This powerful man who controlled billions in assets, who commanded boardrooms and shaped Atlanta's skyline, now cradling a 7-pound infant with an expression of absolute wonder and terror. Eliza squirmed slightly, her eyes opening to gaze up at this unfamiliar face. Instead of crying, she simply stared, as if trying to make sense of the new person in her world. "Hello, Eliza," Nathaniel said softly, his voice catching. "I'm your father." The simple introduction, spoken with such genuine emotion, brought unexpected tears to Madison's eyes. Whatever happened between her and Nathaniel, whatever complicated path they would navigate as co-parents, this moment, this first real connection between father and daughter, felt sacred somehow. Eliza yawned widely, apparently unimpressed by the monumental nature of the introduction, which made both adults smile. "She has your eyes?" Nathaniel said, not looking away from the baby's face. "But my mother's expression, that same serious consideration." "She's very observant," Madison agreed. "The pediatrician says she's advanced in her tracking and focus for her age." "Of course she is," Nathaniel murmured, a note of pride already evident in his voice. "She's extraordinary." They settled into a strange, peaceful rhythm over the next hour, Nathaniel asking questions about Eliza's birth, her routines, her preferences, Madison answering with the detailed knowledge only a mother possesses. When Eliza began to fuss, Madison prepared a bottle, then hesitated before handing it to Nathaniel. "Would you like to feed her?" The uncertainty on his face was quickly replaced with determination. "Show me how." Madison guided him through the process, adjusting his hold on both baby and bottle, watching as he concentrated on the task with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations. When Eliza finished eating, Madison demonstrated the proper burping technique, which Nathaniel executed with exaggerated carefulness. "I won't break her," Madison assured him, amused by his tentativeness. I've closed billion-dollar deals less nerve-wracking than this, he admitted, relief evident when Eliza produced the desired burp. As the afternoon progressed into evening, they continued this delicate dance of new parenthood, Madison leading, Nathaniel following with uncharacteristic humility. When Eliza finally fell asleep in her father's arms, he looked up at Madison with an expression she'd never seen before, something raw and transformative. "Thank you," he said simply, "for today." For her. Madison nodded, unable to find adequate words for the complex emotions swirling through her. This was not how she had imagined Eliza's first meeting with her father. Not the angry confrontation she'd feared, nor the cold legal battle she'd dreaded. "This doesn't solve everything," she said finally as Nathaniel carefully placed the sleeping baby in her crib. "We still have a lot to figure out." "I know." He stood looking down at his daughter, the soft nursery light illuminating his profile. "But it's a beginning." As they moved back downstairs, the practical questions that had been temporarily set aside by the magic of meeting Eliza resurfaced. "What exactly are you proposing in terms of involvement?" Madison asked, settling on the neutral term rather than the more loaded custody or visitation. "I'd like regular time with her," Nathaniel replied, taking a seat across from Madison in the living room. "Beyond that, I'm open to what works best for both of you. I recognize you're her primary caregiver, especially while she's this young." The reasonableness of his response was another surprise. The Nathaniel she'd been married to would have demanded equal